We are now going to give over to Honorable Swart to continue asking, interacting with Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, when you were asked at the presentation of the financials last year, particularly about bribes that you had received of any sort, you said, "I can go on record to say I have not received a bribe of any sort or taken a bribe from anybody. I think as it relates to the gifts, I will be submitting a tell-all document. So let's just wait for that and we will see where that lands up." Now, you've also explained that that document is the submission, but there's no mention in that submission of any gifts that you might have received. What did you mean by that, the gifts that you might have received?
I think the question that was posed at the time by the journalist referred to the trips as gifts. I think that was the context within which that question was asked.
And you still deny that any of those trips were paid by any Gupta-related person or Sahara or anything like that, notwithstanding all the invoices that have been showed to you, notwithstanding overwhelming evidence?
Yes, sir.
You still deny that?
Yes, sir.
Now, our standard of proof here is a balance of probabilities. And it's your word against all those other invoices. Why should we believe you? You understand the problem that we've got when it gets to credibility, when it places you, and when we look at the overwhelming amount of evidence that is building up around you. And that's why I plead with you, like Mr. Gordon pleaded with you, to give us a full explanation. You see, it's very clear to me, and I've done a study of the Transnet documents as well, and the involvement of yourself, Mr. Molefe, in assisting Gupta-related companies, Mr. Salim Issa. And we'll get to that in the subsequent Transnet inquiry. But then we see Mr. Molefe going across to Eskom after the previous CEO, Ms. Molefe, was CFO, seemed to be an obstruction. For example, failing to sign the TNA breakfast contract, and she was fired. And a while later, we have Mr. Molefe going across as the CEO, and then subsequently you go as the next CFO. And the pattern that is developing is of the whole process of facilitating Tegeta, facilitating the TNA, and facilitating the whole narrative of state capture. Now, you'll obviously deny that, but what I have to put to you, as others have, is that there is overwhelming evidence that is in the public domain and that you're going to have to face in this forum and in other forums. Are you defending the Helen Suzman Foundation court case against you in your personal capacity? Have you filed a notice of opposition?
Yes, we will defend that.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, we will defend that.
And you've noticed that the Minister of Finance and National Treasury is supporting that application. Do you not see that the cards are falling? Do you not see that, as Mr. Gordon indicated? Do you still stick to your version, and it's very elaborate and there's a lot of documentation there, but that nothing untoward was done on your watch, whether by omission or commission?
So I can only speak to the documentation that is before us and the evidence that is before us, and that is what I've led today.
Okay, so then let me take you through some of the documentation. When Mr. Molefe arrived at Eskom, at that stage, OCM was negotiating on the hardship clause relating to Hendrina. There was progress made in that regard. He confirmed in his evidence that the request for revised Hendrina coal supply was being favorably considered by Eskom before his appointment. Suddenly that is then stopped by Mr. Molefe. He might have had good reasons, but again it plays into the narrative of him wanting to benefit Tegeta. And that was the finding of the public protector. You recall that because you made a representation to the public protector. The public protector said Eskom leant over backwards to accommodate Tegeta. Do you still believe that Eskom did nothing to benefit Tegeta unfairly?
The policies and processes that we needed to comply with, we've complied with the policies and processes.
On the 1st of July 2015, so we understand that OCM was having financial difficulties. July 2015, OCM, Glencore, secures additional funding from Glencore to enable it to continue supplying Eskom. Suddenly there's a problem because now the plan to get Tegeta to take over is going to fail because OCM now has its own funding and it can continue. So what happens on the 16th of July? Eskom serves a notice to claim historical penalties suddenly out of the blue. Never having mentioned it in the past, Eskom then imposes a penalty. The pressure starts to build on Optimum Miles, coal mines. In August, the department suspends the mining operations at OCM with no lawful basis. The pressure increases. The public protector says it can only be interpreted that Eskom wished to exert pressure on OCH and OCM. We see the allegation that a former board chairperson, Mr. Ngubane, is alleged to have approached Minister Ramatlodi to suspend all the licenses of OCM. Are you aware of that? It's denied by Mr. Ngubane, but is there any reason why that former minister would lie and say he was approached to put more pressure on OCM?
I'm not aware of that, sir.
I'm sure you've read of that in the media.
Yes, I have.
There's a contention. Immediately, that minister is then fired and replaced by Mr. Msebenzi Zwane, who then plays a greater role in facilitating the Tegeta deal. Are you aware of that? Organizing it in Switzerland, going to Switzerland. And you indicated the role that the department also played in this, the Department of Minerals now. So you see the pressure building up. Do you understand the narrative? Sorry, continue. I'm asking you, are you aware of that? The pressure building up on OCM.
Via the narrative through the media, yes, I'm aware of that.
Well, I'm putting, these are facts. These are facts that are on affidavit. These are facts that have been disclosed by media houses, and these are facts that are on affidavit in the court case that you have to answer.
So, firstly, in terms of the facts that you mentioned, where you say that, in terms of the facts that you mentioned relating to Glencore never being aware of the penalties prior to July, I think it's probably disingenuous to conclude that that was a fact because they were negotiating the revised contract with the board in November, December 2014, which required the penalties to be waived and the price to be increased. So for them to say that they never knew that the penalties existed is...
Well, I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to respond in affidavit to those allegations as well. All I'm sketching is a chronological time frame of how the pressure was increased. What I couldn't understand was when the whole deal was put together and the guarantee, which we know there were illegalities related to the guarantee, such as the approvals, the board approvals that you admitted were not obtained. And then secondly, the prepayment. Why that prepayment? And you say there was no problem with the prepayment of the 659 million. Do you still believe that there was no problem with that prepayment?
So firstly, sir, I'm not too sure where I admitted that approvals were not obtained.
The board, it never went to the board, the BTC. Are you correct in that? Well, let's just
The
get
guarantee.
this. No, I'm talking about the first guarantee. The first guarantee, right?
Yes.
1.8. You said it did not go, it was not lodged with the BTC,
No, with the board.
with the board.
Yes.
You admitted
But-
that.
But
You
in my
said it
statement,
was for some reason it was not lodged. Is
yes.
that correct?
No, there's a difference. In my statement, I say I had the requisite authority from the board to issue the guarantee. Then the question was asked, why was it not reported? And I explained why it was not reported to the board. There's a difference between
But
the
it
two.
should have been reported.
It should have been reported.
Well, that is what I'm saying. That's basically, okay? So there
Okay.
is.
But
a
there was
problem there.
authority for me
No,
to
I
issue the guarantee.
appreciate that, and
Okay.
thank you for that.
And then secondly, on the 659, in terms of whether it was okay or not, I think certainly it followed all the processes and procedures, and it was issued, and the 659 was made in terms of the 2008 coal mandate, which allowed for prepayments to occur. I've mentioned other prepayments that were made to Cost Plus Mines and other prepayments that were made to other coal miners under the 2008 mandate. We got commercial value for it. So again, in terms of the policies and processes that we needed to comply with, we complied with those policies and procedures.
Why was it paid to Tegeta and not to the business rescue practitioners, as it should have? Because at that stage, the mine was under the control of the business rescue practitioners and not Tegeta.
I would hesitate to say that the business rescue practitioners didn't have a bank account of their own.
No, I'm sorry, that's nonsense. You
No,
know
no.
it was part of the
No, no.
purchase price.
No.
They laid a
the question-
complaint with the Hawks.
The
It was
question
never
that-
investigated because of that whole,
The
and you know
question-
that.
The question that you posed was, why was it not paid to the business rescue practitioners? The business rescue practitioners manages the business on behalf of the owners. So they would never have a bank account of their own. It would have to be paid to Optima. Okay?
Well,
Firstly.
they
Second-
weren't even aware of the payment. Let's just put it that way. They
First-
were surprised. Mr. Marsden's evidence was he was surprised about that payment in total.
So the,
And he then made this statement to the Hawks where he laid a criminal complaint. And you still say that that payment was in order.
from an Eskom perspective, the payment was in order. The contract existed between Tegeta and Eskom. So who was supposed to pay? If I paid the business rescue practitioner, or if I paid Optimum, I would be saying exactly in the Trillian McKinsey problem that we just say that is so bad as well.
Well, we differ on that aspect, and I'm sure the criminal authorities will be investigating that. Sadly, as Mr. Marsden indicated, it was only about a year later when the Hawks approached him, but there seems to be an increased interest in that more recently. But one of the things I found very interesting, I couldn't understand how Tegeta was going to benefit from buying the Optimum coal mining to provide Hendrina at 150 Rand per ton. How could they? Because there was something that had to be done to ensure that they would make a profit. Now, the only way they could do that was to ensure that Eskom cancelled or didn't renew contracts to Arnott, so that Optimum coal could then be used for Arnott at an increased price. You agree that Optimum coal was then sold to provide coal at Arnott. You agree with that?
I don't recall that. But if you say so, then we will take it on
But
face
you
value.
indicated earlier, you were part of that committee that sat when you arrived there to look at the contracts that were coming to an end and the contracts that weren't going to be renewed. And let's have a look at them then, if I might remind you. The Exora cost plus contract to supply Arnott that came to an end might legitimately have been a very expensive one, 1,000 Rand, and you considered not extending that. That was on the 31st of December 2015. The second Arnott contract, this time with Mafube, that was a joint venture between Exara and Anglo-American. That coal was mined just north of the N12 highway and supplied a conveyor belt system to Arnott, a conveyor belt system, okay? Now the Denton's report, you remember the Denton's report? Was that the report that you didn't want to give out? According to Mr. Kwama, who gave evidence here, the communications guy, he said you would not prepare to release the Denton's report, you only wanted to release a redacted version. Is that correct?
Me personally, as in Anoj Singh?
You working together with the board, but his evidence was he mentioned you by name, and I'm sure your lawyers were sitting here, they could vouch for that.
No, sir. I
You
don't
deny
recall
that?
I deny that.
Okay, but that's by the way. But according to the Denton's report, it shows that in July 2015, Mafube produced the cheapest coal on Eskom's books at 132 Rand per ton. Do you remember that or not?
I do not, sir.
But you were supposed to look into these issues when you did the due diligence on the Tegeta contract. Because this was one of the contracts that came to an end.
So as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, the operational issues relating to...
Sorry, Mr. Singh, we're running late. I'm tired.
Sorry, my bad.
I'm also struggling to hear you. And can I just ask you to pass it off to the operational people? You see, you're a director. You're the financial director. You have to accept responsibility. You also indicated that you chaired or you sat on this committee that dealt with these contracts. What was the scope of that committee that dealt with the ending of these contracts? You would get operational people that would come and report you, but you had to take those decisions yourself.
The committee that we're talking about is a primary energy steering committee. It was established, I would assume, way after the transactions that you are mentioning, or you mentioned currently around the Exaro contract and so on and so forth. It was, I think, established in early 2016, somewhere around there, if I recall correctly. So it would not have had sight of all of the contracts that you mentioned. Again, I'm standing to correction, but I think so. In terms of the second question that you posed,
No, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt then as far as that committee is concerned. But the point that I want to make is the Mafube contract with a conveyor belt system to the Arnott mine had been operating since 2004, had delivered 1.8 million tons per year to Arnott, and it was to go on until the end of 2023. Now, the Exara spokesman, Mr. Mzila Mtenjani, said the contract came to an end. Eskom's decision to terminate the contract without reason in December 2015. Everything happened in December 2015. And that's the answer that I was looking for. That's the answer, because that contract should have run on. Suddenly, there's an emergency at Arnott. Emergency supplies. You can deviate from the contract provisions. You can get optimum coal at a much increased price to go to Arnott. And that's what happened. Because at the end of January 2016, 30-ton coal trucks were running from Optimum Mine to Arnott. And that is where Tegeta got the increase. And instead of getting 150 Rand per ton for Hendrina, they were suddenly getting 420 odd Rand per ton for supplying Optimum coal to Arnott. That is one of the reasons why the public protector said Eskom leant over backwards to accommodate Tegeta. And that is the overwhelming evidence, which you don't seem to grasp, you've got a lot of documentation, and it is helpful. I went through it in great detail, and I'm grateful for that. But you only tell half the story, because there's another side of it, which you could say was the operational people, you had knowledge of it. But remember, in terms of the Companies Act, you have to accept fiduciary duty. And you're not just a normal director, you are the CFO. And let me just remind you, Section 76, Standards of Directors' Conduct, that you are to act in good faith and for a proper purpose in the best interest of the company, with the degree of care, skill, and diligence that may be reasonably expected of a person, having the general knowledge, skill, and experience of that director. That director. That means you, Mr. Singh. That means you as a chartered accountant, not a normal person. You have a higher standard that is required of you. And we, and this committee would submit that you failed in that responsibility. You failed, dismally. And we see the developments, and we see that you try to portray that Eskom has improved on your watch, but it just flies against everything and the evidence that we've heard. Take the Trillion contract. We had the Trillion people come in here and telling us the work was not necessary. You must have read that evidence. They said they were upset. They said that Eskom could have done that work themselves. The G9 forensics investigation into Trillion. Trillion became the illegitimate beneficiary of funds on the back of a turnaround project which McKinsey was supposed and contracted to undertake. This is the G9 forensic investigation. You're aware of it? You might not have read it.
I'm aware of it. I've not.
Let's just see what their conclusion is. It is our considered opinion that irrespective of whether Trillion provided the services or not, Mr. Anoj Singh was in direct contravention of several fundamental tenets of the Eskom procurement policy. That's directly against you.
I would then respectfully submit as well. Are you aware of the fact that G9 has retracted that report?
Well, that adds to the evidence that is against you. In addition, you've got the Trillion people coming here and telling us that the work was not necessary.
So I'll again respectfully request.
Sorry, I'm not finished. I'm not finished. And in fact, saying that the 600 million that was paid by Eskom to Trillion should be repaid. Did you follow that evidence at all? You may proceed.
The only curious comments that I have to make relating to the evidence by the Trillion employees is that they were part and parcel of a program that was deployed within Eskom. And during the period of their servicing Eskom, none of them saw fit to report to the steering committee that oversaw their work. That one, they were actually attending Eskom every day, not doing anything. They did not bother to inform myself, the group executives that they were reporting to, that they were actually at Eskom every day, just coming and eating and going back home, because that's what it amounts to. I find that very hard to believe, and it's actually curious. There were a number of Eskom employees. If you look at the entire Master Services Agreement, as we call it, there were 150 odd Eskom employees that were deployed across all of the work streams that were undertaken by McKinsey and Trillion. None of those individuals came to me and said, listen, Trillion is here and they're not doing anything. So on the objective evidence that was before me, and in my own personal interactions, as I said to you before, as it's quoted in my evidence, the funding plan for the 14-15 or 15-16 corporate plan was 2 pages. How do you execute a borrowing program of excess 200 billion with a borrowing plan of 2 pages?
I understand that, and I accept what you say, but we also have Miss Bianca Goodson that came and indicated that she would sit with Mr. Mashelikoko and will speak to him and express her frustrations at the supply development program of Trillion, that there was nothing happening. And that McKinsey would say, well, you get in your cut, don't complain. And that moved her to tears, and we'll put that as well. So are you saying that that is not something that should be considered?
No, not at all. I think those concerns were raised with us, and I think if you look at one of the minutes of the steering committee that was established to manage the project, that was one of the reasons, one of the concerns that we raised with McKinsey. I think it was the first or the second steerco that we raised those concerns with McKinsey.
Can I just ask you now, Mr. Godon asked you at length about the financials. And it's a great concern to us, and I'm sure it should be of you as well, and all people that are watching, is the state, the financial state of Eskom, and the risk it poses to our whole economy, to the fiscus, to our guarantees. And you indicated in your term that there'd been a turnaround, and yes, the diesel was used far less, and there were some positive aspects. But let's just look at the financials up to March of 2017. 85% decline in pre-tax profit. Would you agree with that? 85%. That is what was indicated.
Agreed.
1 billion rand was your pre-tax profit, down from 5 billion rand the previous year. Would you say that that is, on an asset basis that is estimated to be 710 billion rand? Isn't that appalling? That's not an improvement, that's actually shocking. And that is what many of the commentators, you would have read them, have said it's appalling. It's scandalous, in fact.
Our response to that, as explained in the results presentation, was that yes, it's a concern in terms of the drop from 5 to 1. But from an Eskom perspective and a rating agency perspective, the rating agencies are more concerned around cash profits. The difference between 5 and 1 is by and large the increase in interest as well as depreciation. And from a depreciation perspective, that's non-cash cost, and also the increase in taxation, which was primarily deferred taxation, which is not a cash cost. So hence we measure particularly an organization such as Eskom, which is a relatively capital-intensive business, on EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxation, and amortization, which effectively showed increases, as I outlined before, as well as the fact that that EBITDA increase has to be reflected in your cash generated from operations, because that then effectively assures you that whatever profits that you are generating actually is converted into cash. And if you compare the increases in EBITDA and the increases in cash generated from operations, they relatively dovetail.
Thank you. And that's a very complex explanation, which I accept. But at the end of the day, I, as a lame person, read 1 billion down from 5 billion. That's what I read. And that's what I accept. And so to me, it's not an improvement at all. The 20 billion rand cost saving, was that not mainly because of lower sales, meant primary energy costs were down, and there was less diesel in particular that was used, and coal? Is that not the main challenge, is that your energy costs were totally down?
The energy costs were down. I would suggest, in my view, the 20 billion cost savings was in 2017, and that was by and large all coal cost savings. In 2015-16, The 17 billion was largely attributable to the reduction in diesel usage. And again, you may say that it's volume related, but it's pretty much a small portion of that is volume related, but by and large, I would say 90% of it is related to the improvement in the energy availability factor in 15-16, and then 16-17, as I said, the biggest chunk of that is related to the increase in the productivity of the cost plus mines.
The interest costs ballooned by 82% during that year. Is that correct? That's the information I have, 82%.
It did increase, I'm not
And
too
that's
sure
massive.
Yes.
That is according to the financial statements.
Yes.
That's not an achievement. That's dismal.
Yes, but there's a reason for that, sir.
Well, of course, you see, you're offering reasons for all this, but put it all together and it shows a dismal financial situation.
Well, if you look at my statement, sir, my opening paragraph or opening pages basically said that when I got there, the financial sustainability of Eskom was a concern, and is still a concern. And actually, it's exacerbated by NERSA's recent decision of a 5% tariff increase.
Well, I think, sorry, it's aggravated
Yes.
by the action of the board. It's not NERSA's fault. It's the action of the board and management at Eskom. That, to me, don't blame the, because this is a continual problem that NERSA is blamed for not giving a sufficient increase. That increase has to be passed on to the consumer. When Eskom is wasting funds, let's just look at the irregular expenditure. 3 billion rand irregular expenditure, which was up from 348 million the previous year. So don't blame NERSA when Eskom is wasting the money. Would you agree with that?
So I would, to an extent, I think there is a case to be made relating to irregular and fruitless and wasteful expenditure. But by and large, if you look at an entity as large as Eskom, I find it difficult as a finance person to understand how an entity as large as Eskom can survive with a 2% tariff increase in 1 year and a 5% tariff increase in another. By and large, over 2 years, if you combine the two tariff increases, you get a 7% tariff increase. On average, there's a 3.5% tariff increase per year, when inflation, general inflation in the country is at about 6%. So I find, notwithstanding the fact that fruitless and wasteful expenditure and all of these type of things need to be looked at, but the reality of the situation is that the interest costs that Eskom is incurring has to be serviced, and the interest cost is a direct function of the new build program. And I think, as the Minister of Finance has said, a funding model for Eskom has to be a new funding model for Eskom has to be identified. Otherwise, Eskom,
I agree with you that the whole scenario and the whole model of Eskom has to be reconsidered, and that hopefully the new board will be doing, because demand has changed, everything has changed. What was your reason for contacting President Zuma and at the State of the Nation to discuss the issue of renewables? Why would you not have discussed that with your minister? What did you expect the president to do?
We did not contact the president.
No, you indicated, I might have misunderstood you, that you were asked the question, have you ever had any discussions with President Zuma?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated you had a discussion with him on this issue.
Yes, sir.
So it begs the question, what else did you understand that when we are speaking about the involvement of President Zuma, the involvement of the Gupta family, the involvement, that it opens the question as to what else did you discuss with President Zuma?
As I mentioned before, sir, I did not request the meeting. I was requested to attend the meeting, which I did. I provided my input, and that was it.
I'm sorry, I didn't, was that, I missed that evidence then, because it seemed to be that, was it at Parliament, was it at the State of the Nation?
No. I said, following the State of the Nation address, where the President had announced that Eskom would be signing the power purchase agreements with independent power producers, Eskom still was reluctant to sign the power purchase agreements. The Minister of Energy, the Minister of Public Enterprises engaged. We engaged both of them at the I'm not too sure whether it was a Minister of Energy or whether it was a Minister of Public Enterprises, arranged a meeting with the President, and we then went to brief the President around Eskom's problems relating to the signing of the power purchase agreements.
Was Minister Lynn Brown aware of that discussion?
I think Minister Brown and Minister Joe Matt Peterson were actually at the meeting.
At present at
Yes,
the meeting?
yes.
Because we've got other evidence of a previous board chairman, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, being summoned to President Zuma's residence in Durban and given certain instructions. You might have heard of those, that evidence as well. Did that ever happen to you?
No,
To anyone that you're aware of?
no.
So you indicated in the questioning by journalists in quite a dismissive fashion, you used the word soap operification. What did you mean by that? Operification. It seems to be soap operification. It seems that all this evidence that is in the public domain, the Gupta leaks, it is all soaperification. It's fiction in your mind. Is that, would you say it's fiction?
No, I think the comment was made relating to the specific allegations that were being levied against myself relating to Trillian, McKinsey.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I said it was relating to, the comment was made specifically relating to my involvement in these transactions, relating to the guarantee, the prepayment, the McKinsey Trillian transaction, the G9 report, the Oliver Wyman report, and all of these other media reports that sensationalize the issues compared to the evidence that we've provided today.
But you haven't provided all those reports in your evidence.
Those, well,
Are you referring to those reports also as being fiction?
no, I'm just saying
But those media reports were based on those reports, were they not?
that, as I am saying, if you look at the G9 report, for example, the G9 report was issued, but as I understand it now, I think it's been withdrawn, if you want to call it that. It was issued for one purpose, and it was used for another purpose completely. So that's the context within which we make the comment. I think what we are saying is, if you look at what perception the media is creating versus what the paper trail is suggesting, is that there is a disjuncture between the two. And that's what it's meant to
National Treasury recommended a forensic audit. You appeared before Parliament and there was a whole discussion around the issues and your difference of approach. I don't know if you were there, but the approach of Eskom versus National Treasury, there was huge debates about the Tegeta coal contracts. Were you part of those discussions at Parliament as well?
I recall attending a SCOPA meeting where we were required to speak about the PwC report, if I recall correctly, but I think that was the only meeting that I was present at where National Treasury and Eskom were debating,
Yes.
or presenting, relating to Tegeta.
And the PwC report had red flagged Tegeta already. That report in an earlier contract, yet that PwC report seemed to have been ignored by Eskom when they engaged Tegeta. Are you aware of that?
If I recall correctly, again, the first PwC report was done as part of an internal audit review. Internal audit had come to the conclusion that they did not have the technical expertise to undertake this review, and therefore outsourced it to PwC. And when the PwC selection was made, it selected Tegeta as well as, I think, 4 other mines. So I think there was 5 mines that were selected in total. They had raised certain red flags. Management had, I think, addressed some of them. This was before I got there. that this PwC report, I think, was done. I only got to know about the PwC report when National Treasury actually wrote to us and said, can we have a copy of this report? And at that stage, I then engaged with the internal audit team and asked them for the report. They submitted the report, and then I engaged the primary energy team and said, guys, what did you do with all these findings? And that's when we, and the primary energy team resolved the findings. Subsequent to that, we got PwC backing to confirm that the findings that have been fixed by management was indeed fixed.
One of the issues that was a concern was the standard of the coal from the Brackfontein colliery. And you indicated earlier to us that at one stage, Mr. Coker, and we'll ask him tomorrow, suspended, and that suspended the delivery of Tegeta Brackfontein coal because it was not up to standard. And that had been a problem right from the word go, but then the scientists were suspended. Are you aware of that? And that there's a scientist that is still on suspension, Mr. Mark van der Riet.
As part of the submissions to SCOPA, I think we did allude to those facts. But as I said, I think those happened as I just got there. So I was not part and parcel of the actual exercise that happened.
But it's not in your submission to us today, those issues relating to Tegeta and the problems with the Brackfontein mines, that history. You didn't think it necessary to mention it to us?
No, not really.
But you took great pains to explain why it was necessary and why it was justifiable to have the Tegeta mines involved and the optimum and the whole contracts. You took a lot of trouble to explain that, but you didn't give the full history. The PwC report, the problems with Brackfontein colliery, the fact that Mr. Coker himself suspended them for a short while, but within 5 days they were reinstated. And Eskom's top scientist and Ms. Charlotte Ramavona, another top scientist, coal scientist, they were suspended. Are they still on suspension?
So I'm not too sure.
They are. Let me tell you, they are still on suspension. Is that not a concern? Maybe it's human resources. Your top scientists have been suspended for casting aspersions on a Gupta-related coal, Tegeta coal from Brackfontein.
So I'll be of limited use to provide a response to that
Sorry,
question.
you?
I said I would be of limited use to provide a response to that question. Maybe you can pose it to Mr. Coker.
But it adds to the overwhelming evidence of the support that Tegeta got from Eskom. Do you not agree?
I could agree if I was part of the exercise that suspended them and I understood why.
Are you disputing that they have been suspended?
No, sir, I am not. I just said that I was the one who told you that they were suspended.
No,
because
you never told us they were suspended. That those scientists were suspended. You never told us they were suspended.
No, I did not.
You told us that the license of Brackfontein was suspended.
The coal supply agreement, yes.
But why has no one, Eskom, told us the status of those two top scientists that are still on suspension? It's almost 2 years.
Well, in terms of the documentation that was, the documentation covers the topics that I was requested to cover. In terms of the submission to SCOPA that related specifically to the PwC report, that was disclosed to SCOPA at the time.
My colleagues are saying I should wind up, so I need to just confirm and say to you that whilst you have assisted me with that lengthy documentation, there's far more. There's so much more. And it plays into everything that we've suspected from the word go as to a narrative that is put out. There's a booklet. I'm sure you've read that booklet. The overwhelming and growing body of evidence has been built. It suggests that power vested in the president, it's President Zuma, certain ministries, and the boards and executives of SOCs, and in this case Eskom, has been misused to benefit the interests of connected individuals and entities, and most prominently, the Gupta family. Now, Treasury recommends a forensic audit to establish why Eskom gave and continues to give preferential treatment to Tegeta by not enforcing key conditions of the coal supply contracts, and why Eskom, through its former Chief Executive Brian Molefe, gave assurances that the Brackfontein colliery supplied and continues to supply coal that is not in accordance with the coal supply agreement, despite ample evidence that there was non-compliance. And those are what the scientists have said. So that, I believe, I support what Mr. Gordhan said about the breaches. The Public Protector found serious breaches of the Public Finance Management Act as set out. In addition to that, Mr. Singh, that clause that I read to you from the Companies Act requires a higher standard from you, the fiduciary duty, a higher standard, you as a chartered accountant, as I read that to you. And I would agree with Mr. Gordhan that an application should be brought against all directors involved in what has happened at Eskom to have the boards, including yourself, declared delinquent directors. Thank you, Chairperson.